The Secret Phone, a story of betrayal and redemption. The sun had barely set, casting an orange glow over the quiet suburban streets. The world felt like it was standing still, but for Matthew, everything felt chaotic. He sat in his car parked across the street from his house, his fingers gripping the steering wheel as though it might anchor him to something solid. It had been weeks now, weeks of quiet unease gnawing at the pit of his stomach, each passing day feeling like a slow unraveling of the life he thought he knew. He had been married to Sandra for 6 years, and for the most part, their life together had been peaceful, almost idyllic. They had their moments, of course, any couple did, but in general, things had been comfortable. That was, until recently. Matthew wasn't sure when it started, but the little signs were there. Sandra had become more distant, always buried in her phone or her laptop. Late nights at work, hours spent alone in their bedroom with the door closed. She laughed off his questions with a quick kiss on the cheek, brushing them off like they were nothing. But Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The little things, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the way she'd pull her phone away from him when he entered the room, began to form a picture in his mind. And that picture, though blurry at first, was starting to become more and more clear. Something, or rather someone, was standing between them. The idea had come to him one night, quietly settling into his thoughts like a seed. What if there's someone else? The thought shocked him at first. His Sandra, the woman he had promised to share his life with, the woman who had stood by him in their darkest hours, could she really be betraying him? The thought was too much to ignore. The feeling in his gut was undeniable. He had to know the truth. And so, one evening after dinner, when Sandra had left to run errands, Matthew made a decision. He would go through her car. It wasn't something he had ever done before, and the very idea felt like a violation of the trust they had built. But that restless feeling had become unbearable. He couldn't sit idly by anymore, hoping that his suspicions were nothing more than a product of his own paranoia. The darkness was settling in as he quietly approached Sandra's car. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew that if there was a clue, it would be here. His heart pounded in his chest as he checked the door handle, unlocked. She must have forgotten to lock it, he thought, trying to justify the situation to himself. He slid inside, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. The car was mostly clean, nothing out of the ordinary. But as his eyes scanned the interior, something caught his attention. Beneath the passenger seat, there was an object partially hidden, a phone. Not the kind of phone Sandra normally used. His breath caught in his throat as he reached down and pulled it out. It felt cold and unfamiliar in his hand. What is this? He wondered. It wasn't her work phone, nor did it match the phone she always kept with her. And yet, there it was, tucked away as though it didn't belong. His hands shook as he powered it on, heart racing in anticipation of what might await him on the other side. The screen lit up, revealing a series of messages that made his blood run cold. They were flirty, intimate, and full of promises that had no place in his marriage. Photos followed, photos of Sandra, smiling with a man Matthew didn't recognize. The images were intimate, personal, pictures that only someone in her closest circle would have. His stomach turned as the evidence mounted. In that moment, everything in Matthew's life shifted. The life he thought he had was shattered in an instant. Sandra, the woman he trusted more than anyone, had been hiding something from him. Something he wasn't prepared for. The sound of a car door slamming outside jerked him back to reality. Sandra was back. Matthew quickly shoved the phone into his pocket, his mind whirling. He couldn't keep this to himself any longer. He had to confront her. But as he stepped out of the car, he wasn't sure what would happen next. All he knew was that the truth, whatever it was, had just come crashing into his life. The seconds felt like hours as Matthew stood frozen by Sandra's car, his heart racing. He could hear her footsteps approaching, the sound of her heels clicking against the pavement, oblivious to the storm that was brewing just a few feet away. His mind was spinning, trying to process what he had just seen on that phone. But there was no mistaking it. The messages, the photos, they were too intimate, too personal to be anything but what they were, evidence of her affair. He could feel the weight of the phone in his pocket, its cold presence a constant reminder of the betrayal that had just unraveled before him. His stomach churned as the reality of it all began to settle in. He couldn't look at Sandra the same way again. Every moment, every word they had shared over the years now felt like a lie. As Sandra reached the front door, she flashed him a smile. "Hey," she said, her voice light and cheerful, as if nothing was amiss. "Hey," Matthew replied, his voice tight, barely masking the storm brewing inside him. They exchanged small talk as she set her bag down on the kitchen counter, still unaware that the man she had vowed to love and cherish was standing on the edge of a precipice, ready to confront her with the devastating truth. Matthew forced himself to act normal, to keep his composure, but inside, he was falling apart. Every laugh, every touch, every word Sandra spoke felt like a cruel mockery. "So, how was your day?" she asked, slipping off her shoes and padding into the living room. Matthew took a deep breath. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was his life unraveling, and he needed answers. He couldn't ignore what he had just seen. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no going back. "I found something," he said, his voice unexpectedly calm, though his heart was pounding in his chest. Sandra stopped in her tracks, glancing over her shoulder at him. The smile that had been on her face faltered, just for a split second, but it was enough for Matthew to notice. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice now laced with a hint of nervousness. Without waiting for her to say anything else, Matthew pulled the phone from his pocket and held it out toward her. "What's this?" he demanded, the words falling from his mouth like a blow. His hands were trembling, but he held his ground, staring at her with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. Sandra's face went pale as she saw the phone in his hand. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. For a long, agonizing moment, she simply stood there, looking at the phone, then back at Matthew, a flicker of panic flashing in her eyes. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice shaking. Matthew's eyes burned with fury. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could she lie to him so easily? How could she stand there, pretending that nothing was wrong, when the evidence was staring both of them in the face? "Don't lie to me, Sandra," Matthew said, his voice low but firm. "I've seen everything. The messages. The photos. This is not a mistake. I know what's been going on." Sandra took a step back, her eyes wide with shock. She opened her mouth to speak again, but Matthew cut her off, his anger boiling over. "You've been seeing someone else, haven't you? All this time, you've been hiding it from me. I trusted you." His voice cracked as the weight of his emotions came crashing down on him. Sandra's face contorted with guilt, but she still tried to hold on to some semblance of control. "Matthew, please, it's not what you think. I'm not having an affair. This is all a misunderstanding. You're just what? Paranoid?" Matthew interrupted, his voice rising. "I saw it with my own eyes. I'm not imagining this. You've been with another man. Behind my back." Sandra's expression faltered. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to gather her thoughts, but when she opened them again, there was no escaping the truth. Her shoulders slumped in defeat, and the tears began to well up in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Matthew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant to hurt you. It just happened." The words hung in the air, suffocating them both. Matthew's heart shattered at her confession. His mind was racing, his emotions a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and confusion. How could she do this to him? How could she betray everything they had built together? For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was deafening, each of them struggling to come to terms with the devastation that had been exposed. Matthew felt the sting of tears in his eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. He wasn't going to cry. Not yet. He had to hold it together, to make sense of the mess his life had become. "I need some time, Sandra," he finally said, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to stay composed. "I need to figure out what I'm going to do. I can't just pretend this didn't happen." Sandra nodded, her face crumpling with guilt. "I understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you, Matthew. I'm so sorry." But no amount of apologies could take away the betrayal that had just shattered their marriage. No amount of remorse could undo the damage that had already been done. As Matthew turned and walked away, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. His heart ached as he realized that the woman he loved had betrayed him in a way he couldn't even fathom. And now, he had to find a way to pick up the pieces of his broken life. The silence that followed Matthew's departure was suffocating. The air in the living room felt heavy, as if it carried the weight of everything unsaid. Sandra stood there, her hands trembling at her sides, her heart hammering in her chest. The phone she had tried so desperately to keep hidden was now out in the open, its secrets laid bare. Her mind raced, but there was no escaping the crushing guilt that had taken root in her soul. She couldn't take it back. She couldn't undo the hurt she had caused. Matthew had left, and part of her felt a wave of relief. At least he was gone, at least he couldn't see her broken expression. But that relief was fleeting. It wasn't the end, not by a long shot. Sandra knew that this was only the beginning of what would be the hardest conversation of her life. She had to face the consequences of her actions. She had to find a way to explain herself, even if she didn't fully understand why she had done what she did. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours before Matthew returned. He didn't say a word when he walked in. The tension between them was thick, a gulf of distrust and hurt that neither of them could ignore. Sandra could see the pain in his eyes, and it nearly broke her. She had been the one to cause that pain, the one to destroy the trust they had built together. And now she had to find a way to justify the unthinkable. "Matthew," Sandra began, her voice shaking as she tried to meet his gaze. "Please, just hear me out." But Matthew wasn't looking at her with the same affection he once had. His face was hard, his jaw clenched in anger and disbelief. His eyes were dark, haunted by the betrayal he had just uncovered. He crossed his arms over his chest and leaned against the doorframe, his body language closed off, defensive. "I don't even know where to start," Matthew said, his voice low and cold. "What were you thinking, Sandra? How could you do this to me?" Sandra swallowed, her throat dry. She had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier. The words she had prepared seemed to escape her, leaving her only with a vague sense of helplessness. "I never meant for this to happen," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't planned. It just happened." Matthew raised an eyebrow, disbelief and frustration written all over his face. "It just happened," he repeated, his voice rising. "Sandra, don't insult my intelligence. You've been carrying on an affair behind my back. This isn't just something that happened. You made choices. Over and over again. You chose him. You chose to lie to me." Sandra winced at the harshness of his words, but she didn't deny them. She couldn't. There was no excuse, no explanation that would make it right. But she had to try. "Matthew, I know I've betrayed you, and I'm so sorry. I don't even know how it got this far. But I never stopped loving you." "I still love you," Sandra said, her voice cracking with emotion. She took a tentative step forward, as if hoping he might soften, even just a little. "Please, believe me. This wasn't about you. It was about me. I got lost, and I thought I could find something outside of us. But now I see how wrong I was. Matthew shook his head, unable to believe what he was hearing. He had been asking himself the same question over and over since he found the phone: why? Why would she do this? How could she look him in the eye and claim that she loved him while carrying on with another man? You're telling me you were so lost that you just decided to destroy everything we had? Matthew's voice cracked as he took a step toward her, his anger barely contained. And now you expect me to believe that you still love me? After all this? Sandra's eyes welled with tears, and for a moment, she could barely look at him. The pain in his eyes was too much to bear. She had caused this. She had brought them to this point, and there was no escaping it. I don't expect you to forgive me, Sandra said, her voice filled with guilt. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't want you to think that what we had didn't matter. It did. It still does. But I made a terrible mistake, and now I have to live with it. Matthew stared at her for a long moment, the silence between them deafening. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, confusion, hurt, anger. How could she do this? How could she throw away everything they had worked for? He took another step back, putting distance between them, as if that might help him make sense of it all. I don't even know who you are anymore, he muttered, his voice filled with pain. The woman I married. I don't know her. And I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Sandra felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. She had expected anger, but this felt like something else. This felt like the end. And she wasn't sure if she could fix it. I'm sorry, Matthew. I'm so sorry. But I don't know how to fix this, she said, her voice barely audible. Matthew stood in the doorway, his shoulders hunched, as though the weight of the conversation had drained him completely. He was exhausted, emotionally and physically, and he knew that nothing he said could undo the damage. I need some space, he finally said, his words cutting through the tension. I need to think. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I need time. Sandra nodded, her tears flowing freely now. She didn't argue, didn't try to stop him. She knew she had no right to. As Matthew walked away, Sandra sank to the couch, her hands covering her face. She had broken her own heart, and now she was left with nothing but the fragments of a love that was slipping through her fingers. Days passed, but the silence in the house remained. The once warm and lively home that Matthew and Sandra had built together now felt cold, barren, like a shell of what it used to be. Matthew spent most of his time away, either at work or out walking the streets, trying to clear his head, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. He had never imagined in a million years that Sandra, the woman he had loved so deeply, would betray him. But the evidence was irrefutable, and the pain of the truth seemed to wrap around him like a vice, squeezing the life out of him little by little. Sandra, on the other hand, was in turmoil. She spent her days in a fog of guilt and regret, torn between the man she had fallen in love with and the betrayal she had so foolishly committed. Every room she entered felt like a reminder of her broken promises. The house, once a place of comfort, now seemed suffocating, haunted by her own actions. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, but Sandra didn't even need to check it to know who it was from. She had already received several messages from the man she had been seeing, Liam. She hadn't responded. It felt wrong now. The thought of her affair, the life she had been living behind Matthew's back, was a bitter pill she could no longer swallow. She hadn't been ready to face the consequences of her actions, but now, she was living in them, and they were crushing her. She had tried to reach out to Matthew several times, but each time, he had avoided her attempts to communicate. She understood why. How could he forgive her for this? How could she ask for forgiveness when she knew she had destroyed the foundation of everything they had worked so hard for? As the days wore on, Sandra found herself unable to sleep. The guilt kept her awake at night, and when she did manage to sleep, nightmares haunted her dreams. She dreamed of losing Matthew forever, of him walking away and never looking back. The thought was unbearable. She had lost him once, and she couldn't imagine the pain of losing him for good. But it wasn't just the fear of losing him that kept her awake, it was the shame of what she had done. She had never intended for things to go this far. In the beginning, it had been an escape, a fleeting moment of feeling wanted, of feeling alive in a way that her marriage had stopped making her feel. But now, as the full weight of her actions hit her, she realized how deeply she had hurt the man who had given her everything. One evening, as she sat in their living room staring blankly at the walls, Matthew came home earlier than usual. He didn't say anything as he passed by her. He was distant, but that was to be expected. He wasn't the same man who had left that morning. He was a stranger now, a version of himself that was guarded, broken, and angry. Sandra stood up slowly, her voice shaky as she called after him, "Matthew." He stopped at the foot of the stairs, not turning to face her. He was so still, so quiet, that it felt like the entire house was holding its breath. "I know you need space, but can we talk?" she asked softly, her voice thick with emotion. Matthew's shoulders tensed, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "I don't know what there is left to say, Sandra," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth it once held. "You've said enough already. You've shown me who you really are." Sandra's heart sank at his words, but she pressed on, unable to stop herself. "I never meant to hurt you, Matthew. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I made a terrible mistake." He turned to face her then, his eyes dark and full of emotion, though it was clear that the anger he felt was eclipsed by the hurt. "Do you even understand what you've done, Sandra? Do you get it? You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed our trust. You ruined everything. And now you want to apologize like it's just something that can be fixed." Sandra opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She couldn't find a way to explain the depth of her regret, the full weight of what she had done. She had no excuse. The affair wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal. And she couldn't take it back. She couldn't erase the pain she had caused. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do, Matthew," Sandra whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know if I can fix this." Matthew stepped closer to her, and for a moment, their eyes locked. The pain in his gaze was almost unbearable to look at, but Sandra couldn't look away. He was hurting, and she had caused it. "I don't know either," Matthew said quietly. "But I can't just forget this, Sandra. I can't pretend like nothing happened. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you again." Sandra's heart shattered at his words. Trust, such a fragile thing. She had broken it, and no matter how many times she apologized, it didn't seem like it could be mended. "I'm sorry," Sandra whispered again, but this time, she knew that words would never be enough. Matthew stood there for a long time, silent and unreadable. Then, he finally spoke again, his voice softer this time, but laced with pain. "I need to think, Sandra. I can't do this right now." And with that, he walked away, leaving Sandra standing in the middle of the living room, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. The days dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity for Sandra. The weight of the silence between her and Matthew was unbearable. Every time she caught a glimpse of him, whether he was passing by her in the hallway or sitting at the kitchen table, her heart broke all over again. He was a stranger to her now, his face marked with the pain she had caused. She couldn't shake the image of his hurt, of the way his eyes had looked at her during their last conversation, eyes that were once full of love and trust, now empty and distant. Sandra had tried everything to reach him, but Matthew had built an emotional wall between them, and no amount of apologies or attempts at explanation seemed to make a difference. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't shouting. He was just numb. It was like the man she once knew, the man she had loved so deeply, had slipped through her fingers. She felt utterly powerless. One evening, after another round of sleepless nights, Sandra decided to confront the reality of their situation. She needed to know if there was any chance of salvaging their relationship or if it was truly beyond repair. The silence had gone on long enough. She had to know where they stood. When Matthew returned home that night, Sandra was already waiting for him in the living room. She had been sitting there for hours, gathering the strength to face him. Her nerves were frayed, but she knew this was the moment. She could no longer live in limbo. Either they would find a way to rebuild what had been shattered, or they would part ways for good. As Matthew walked through the door, he paused when he saw her sitting on the couch. There was no anger in his eyes this time, just an almost painful indifference. He wasn't ready to engage with her, but Sandra wasn't going to let this go. She had to know. "Matthew, can we talk?" she asked softly, her voice trembling but firm. He didn't move immediately, as if weighing the decision in his mind. Finally, he nodded and sat down across from her. His posture was stiff, distant, like he was bracing himself for something. Sandra noticed how much he had changed since the discovery of her affair. It wasn't just the way he looked at her anymore, it was the way he carried himself, the way he spoke to her. He was no longer the man who had held her close in their darkest moments. He was someone else entirely. Sandra took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know if she was ready for the answer, but she had to ask. "I've been thinking a lot, about us," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "About everything that's happened. And I just need to know, can we move past this? Is there any way we can rebuild what we had?" For a long time, Matthew didn't respond. He just stared at her, his face unreadable. Sandra could feel the tension building between them, and she hated it. She hated the uncertainty. She hated that this moment had come to this, that she had let it all fall apart. "Do you really think we can fix this?" Matthew finally asked, his voice low but sharp, cutting through the heavy silence. Sandra bit her lip, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "I don't know. But I want to try. I love you, Matthew. I know I've hurt you, and I know I can't take back what I've done, but I want to spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. If you'll let me." Matthew closed his eyes, his face a mixture of pain and exhaustion. He let out a deep sigh, as if he had been holding his breath for far too long. "You say you want to make it right. But do you understand how hard it's going to be?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Do you understand that you've taken something from me that I don't know if I can ever get back?" Sandra nodded slowly. "I do. I know I've taken your trust, and I don't know if I can ever earn it back. But I want to try. I'll do whatever it takes. Just please don't give up on us." Matthew stood up from his seat, pacing slowly around the room, lost in his thoughts. Sandra watched him, her heart in her throat, praying that he would see that she was genuine. That she was truly sorry for everything she had done. Finally, he stopped pacing and turned to face her. There was a long silence before he spoke again. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, his voice raw and full of emotion. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. But I can't just walk away from everything we've built. I can't throw away the years we've spent together without at least trying." Sandra's heart swelled with a mix of hope and relief. There was a chance, just a small chance, that they could find their way back to each other. "So, what does that mean?" Sandra asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. "It means that we're not done yet," Matthew said, his eyes locking with hers. "But it also means that you have to prove to me that you're committed. You have to show me that you're willing to do the hard work to rebuild what's been broken. I can't promise you that everything will go back to the way it was. But we'll take it one step at a time." Sandra nodded eagerly, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for sure, she wasn't giving up on Matthew. Not now, not ever. "I will, Matthew. I'll do whatever it takes. I love you, and I'm not going to let you go. Matthew's face softened for a brief moment, and Sandra could see the flicker of hope in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her the courage to keep going. I know you do, he said quietly. But love isn't enough. We've got a long road ahead of us. Sandra's heart swelled, and though she knew that the road to healing would be long and difficult, she felt a glimmer of hope that they might find their way back to each other. The days after their conversation felt different, but not easy. For Sandra, it was as if a glimmer of hope had sparked inside her, but it was a fragile one, constantly threatened by the weight of her past mistakes. She was willing to work for it, to prove to Matthew that she was committed to making things right. But the path ahead was unclear, and every day was a new challenge. Matthew had been more open to talking, but his walls were still very much in place. It wasn't that he didn't want to forgive her, it was that he wasn't sure he could. And that uncertainty was palpable in every conversation they had. Sandra felt it in the way he looked at her sometimes, his eyes filled with doubt, as though searching for any sign that the woman he once loved was still there beneath the surface. They spent more time together in the weeks that followed, but it was different now. The easy camaraderie they once shared had been replaced with careful, measured conversations. Sandra found herself walking on eggshells, trying not to say the wrong thing, trying not to make any more mistakes. But no matter how hard she tried, there was no escaping the fact that they were both hurting, and no amount of time could erase what had happened. One evening, Matthew suggested they take a walk in the park. It wasn't a date, it wasn't a grand gesture, it was just a simple walk, a way to spend some quiet time together. They needed it, though Sandra wasn't sure if it was because they were trying to heal, or if it was simply a way to be close without having to talk about everything that had gone wrong. As they strolled down the path, the air crisp with the chill of early winter, Sandra glanced over at Matthew. His face was soft, more relaxed than it had been in days, but still distant. She could see the battle raging inside him. She could feel it in the way he held back, in the careful way he spoke. Sandra, he began quietly, breaking the silence between them. I don't know if you realize how much this hurts. She stopped walking, turning to face him. The pain in his voice was raw, and it cut through her like a knife. She had caused this. She had brought them to this point. She had broken him. And no apology, no amount of explaining, could ever truly take that away. I know, she said softly. I know it hurts. And I'll never stop feeling guilty for that. Matthew looked at her, his expression a mixture of pain and uncertainty. Then why did you do it, Sandra? Why did you go outside of our marriage? You promised me you wouldn't, and yet. Sandra's heart sank, and she felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. I don't know, Matthew. I wish I could explain it, but I can't. I wasn't thinking straight. I wasn't thinking about you, or about us. I was selfish. Matthew's eyes softened, just slightly, and for a moment, Sandra thought she saw a flicker of the man she had once known. But just as quickly, it disappeared, replaced by the same guarded expression. I want to believe that you're truly sorry, Sandra. I want to believe that you're willing to do whatever it takes to fix this, Matthew said, his voice strained. But I can't just forget what you did. And I can't just let it slide. Sandra's chest tightened, and she felt a lump in her throat. I know you can't. I don't expect you to. But I'm willing to prove it to you. I'm willing to fight for us, for what we had. Because I know I messed up, but I don't want to lose you. Matthew was quiet for a long time, his gaze on the ground. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of doubt and sadness. I don't know if I can ever get back to where we were, Sandra. I don't know if I can trust you the way I used to. Sandra's heart broke all over again, but she refused to give up. I understand, Matthew. I know it's going to take time. But I'm asking you to give me that time. I'm asking you to give me the chance to show you that I'm still the woman you married. I'm still the woman who loves you. There was a long pause before Matthew spoke again. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. I want to believe you. I really do. But I need to see it, Sandra. I need to see that you're committed to fixing this. To us. Sandra nodded. I'll do whatever it takes, Matthew. I promise. The walk continued in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the oppressive, suffocating silence they had lived in for weeks. It was the kind of silence that came from two people trying to figure out where they stood, trying to figure out if there was hope for the future. Sandra didn't know how long it would take for them to find their way back to each other, but she was willing to do the work. She had hurt Matthew, yes, but she hadn't lost hope. As long as there was still a glimmer of love between them, there was still a chance. Chapter 6 concludes with a sense of tentative hope. Though the road to healing will be long and uncertain, Sandra and Matthew are willing to take the first steps together. In the end, they both know that love is never easy, but it can be worth fighting for. Time had passed, and though the road ahead still held its share of challenges, Sandra and Matthew found themselves in a better place than they had been just a few months ago. The healing process had been slow, but they were no longer trapped in the paralyzing silence that had once defined their relationship. There were still tough moments, and Matthew still had days when his hurt seemed too deep to overcome, but Sandra could see it now, there was hope. They had found a way back to each other, step by step. Each day was an opportunity to rebuild trust, to prove their commitment to one another. Sandra made sure to show Matthew that she was truly sorry for what she had done, that she wasn't just speaking words, she was living them. Every gesture, every action, every small step was a reminder that she had learned from her mistakes and was determined to create a better future for both of them. It wasn't always easy, and there were times when the weight of what had happened hung heavily between them. Matthew still struggled with doubts, and Sandra had moments when she feared it would all fall apart again. But they were honest with each other, more than they had ever been. They talked openly about their feelings, about the pain, the betrayal, and the healing. They went to counseling together, learning how to communicate in ways they never had before. On a sunny afternoon, months after their first conversation about rebuilding their relationship, Sandra found herself sitting with Matthew at the kitchen table, a warm cup of coffee in her hands. There was a comfort between them now that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, but it was there. They had both grown, both changed, and they were learning to embrace their new version of love, one that was built on honesty, forgiveness, and effort. Matthew looked at her over the rim of his own cup, his eyes soft with a tenderness that hadn't been there before. You know, I never thought we'd get here, he said quietly. I didn't think I could forgive you. I didn't think I could ever look at you the same way again. Sandra's heart tightened at his words, but there was no longer a sense of dread when she heard them. There was understanding now. She had lived in that uncertainty, that fear, for so long, but now it was different. They were no longer defined by the past. They had a chance to write their own story. I know, Sandra whispered. I didn't think we'd get here either. But I'm glad we did. I'm glad we're here. Matthew reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers gently brushing against hers. Me too, he said. I still don't know if things will ever be the same, but I think that's okay. Maybe we don't need them to be. Sandra squeezed his hand, a sense of peace settling over her. No, maybe we don't, she agreed. But we can make something new, something stronger. We're still here, together. And that's what matters. They sat in silence for a while, just enjoying the quiet presence of one another. The house, once filled with tension and pain, now felt like a home again. It wasn't perfect, and they both knew there was still work to do, but the foundation was there, a foundation built on a new kind of trust. Weeks passed, and though the scars of the past would always be a part of their story, Sandra and Matthew found joy again in the small moments. They laughed together more often, they shared quiet nights at home, and slowly but surely, they rebuilt their bond. The affair was no longer the elephant in the room. It was a chapter in their story that they had learned from, and though it had almost torn them apart, it had also taught them the true meaning of forgiveness, resilience, and love. One afternoon, Matthew surprised Sandra with a small gift, a framed photo of the two of them from happier times, back when everything was simple and carefree. He placed it on the mantel, next to their wedding photo. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to Sandra. It was a symbol that they were moving forward, that they were no longer trapped by the past. "I know it's not perfect," Matthew said, standing beside her as they looked at the photo. "But it's real. And we're real. And I think that's all we can ask for." Sandra smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think that's enough." If you've enjoyed this story and would like to share your own experiences, please feel free to leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories about love, betrayal, healing, and everything in between.